Hi, I'm Leesa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of Liberty Nation, and joining me today is famed author and historian David Pietrusza, described as, quote, one of the best historians in the United States and one of the great political historians of all time, unquote. Welcome to Liberty Nation TV, Dave.
Good to be here.
Well, you are a prolific author, writing more than a dozen books, but the one we want to focus on today is 1920, the year of the six presidents. You write that the election of 1920 was among history's most dramatic, and considering we've just had another rather dramatic election, I sort of thought it would be fascinating to discuss the many parallels of today and 1 century ago. The news media, I think, is constantly overusing the word unprecedented for seemingly everything notable that happens. As a historian, do you believe so much of what we are seeing today in American political life is truly unprecedented?
Well, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And also, I used to be a baseball historian and scholar, and they'd ask me to compare Babe Ruth to Hank Aaron or whoever, and it's like, and I'd say, well, because the changes in with night baseball or the integration or how do you measure these things? And I say, all things being equal, all things are never equal. So, there are changes between times and what circumstances and all that, but we face the same problems. We're the same people. We're marked by original sin, if I may get theological. And we, what changes from decade to decade and generation to generation is, I think, what sins are popular and what sins are unforgivable. So we do bad things at some point, and then we straighten up in others. So, and we also get very scrupulous about things. Right now, we're in a great scrupulosity about race and ethnicity and all this. But the issues which were in 1920 were our involvement in the world. Are we going to go it alone, or are we going to be America first? That phrase does not go back to the interventionist argument before World War II. It goes back to World War I. It's been around a long time. That was a Harding slogan. He made a phonograph record of one of his speeches called America First. You can listen to it today. So you're talking about that. The Ku Klux Klan is getting up and running at that point. Integration. It's also a time when blacks are voting Republican, when Woodrow Wilson has segregated the District of Columbia, the federal workforce, and now we're legalizing all sorts of substances. And in 1920, we were delegalizing alcoholic beverages. But we weren't actually. That's one of the things which is misunderstood. You could have booze and you could drink booze. There was nothing illegal about that. You just couldn't manufacture it or transport it unless you went through some sort of legal rigmarole. And that's another thing. You get loopholes. You get loopholes in laws, and people will exploit them.
Right, until prohibition, of course, and then
that is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about prohibition, yeah. And there were, so there were ways to get government booze out of those of us of a certain age can remember the W.C. Fields nostalgia boom. Oh, yes, for medicinal purposes only. Well, if you got a prescription from your doctor, and if he knew what was good for you, for him, if he wanted you to come back as a patient, he'd sign out a prescription. And one of the big purveyors of booze in the 1920s were pharmacies. Pharmacies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Get a doctor's prescription and
that's right.
Go. After this interview's over, I'll have to tell you a very funny family story about alcohol and FDR, but I'll leave our viewers hanging for that. Anyway, you're right. There's a lot of cultural differences and similarities, but how do you think the politics of the early 20th century relate to now? And can you give us a couple examples?
Well, you've got the progressive era, which has really started 20 years before 1920. and it gets up and rolling with the muckrakers. And progressivism doesn't start out of nowhere, out of the ether. So there's a populist movement before that, which kind of meant something a little different than the populism of today, but that gives way. So progressivism, there's like these three branches of left-wing, shall we call it, reform, but I'd prefer to call it just change or agitation. And progressivism, which is kind of middle class and in the cities, populism, which is often in the prairies or the South. And that's another thing to think about, is we think about who's going to be on which side of a political spectrum. And so the real racism often comes out of populism in the South or the progressives. Theodore Roosevelt does not allow blacks to be delegates to his Progressive Party convention in 1916, although they had been for years and years and years to Republican political conventions. And then the third thing is outright socialism, which is not yet communism, because there isn't any real communism until 1920 or 1917 when the Bolsheviks take over Russia. But you've got all those three strains. They're often working for the same goals. And then you have the Republicans or even the Democrats. There's a big strand of conservative Democrats going into like the New Deal then. But the conservative, shall we say, reaction in the 1920 election, the reaction from this rising tide of Theodore Roosevelt progressivism really takes hold with the nomination of Warren, Gamaliel Harding, and Calvin Coolidge, two of the most conservative presidents we've ever had in the history of this republic.
Well, I wanted to explore, I want to explore a couple of themes with you, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, how they're impacted by supposed national security threats. So today we see the suppression of conservatives across the big tech platforms. But this is hardly the first time freedom of speech has been under attack.
In 1920, like one of the key things is it's the year of the six presidents. And to back up, they are, because they're all in play in one way or another, T.R. Harding, Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt, who's running for vice president that year, and Herbert Hoover. So they're all involved in one way or another, but there's a semi-major party candidate because he's going to get nearly a million votes when there were a lot less people back then. And he's Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate.
I can't believe you're going to mention him. I have a whole section on him. He was fascinating. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so he's running from Atlanta Penitentiary.
Exactly.
Right.
That's so amazing when I read that.
Mm-hmm. And they let him, basically. I mean, they don't let him out, but they let him send out, little 500-word attacks on American capitalism and society and the major parties. And they even have a photography. They used to have notifications. You wouldn't get the word at the convention. You wouldn't be at the convention to give a speech. You'd get the word afterwards, like, oh, big surprise. You got the nomination, and you give a very long speech. And he gives his little speech from the prison. And they even, because the lighting isn't good, they let him do it again for the photographers outside. So it's a strange sort of repression, but it is repression. And to answer your question, because I've detoured and jumped ahead, is after 1917, sedition. We talk about sedition. And so we have an Espionage Act and we have a Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act is used against opponents of our entry into World War I, who in many cases were socialists, were left-wingers, were pacifists, and that they are packed off to jail. Now, what we have today is where you may be shut down on Twitter or Facebook, etc. Back then, the United States government would be more direct, and the United States government could shut you down from the mail.
Right.
And so magazines would be banned from the United States mail. And that is how they would shut people down when they were not outright arresting them. And then, of course, you might have occasional mob violence. There's the Centralia massacre after World War I, where some veterans and some IWW, International Workers of the World, radicals, mix it up. And there's a horrendous lynching which occurs of one of the radicals, which, interestingly enough, when Franklin D. Roosevelt is campaigning in 1920 as vice president and passes through town, he has no problem with that. No problem with that. You know, it's like, as I say, things were in many cases different then, even though you may have cases of mob violence and repression, which exist, you know, again, not unprecedented. And even in when we get into the war in 1917, it's not just left-wing radicals who are being threatened with being shut down their freedom of speech, but the Wilson cabinet, is discussing, should we be throwing Theodore Roosevelt in jail because he keeps criticizing us? Okay, how dare he? But it's like, well, no, he's Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think we should do this.
Well, you know, as we've seen with President Trump over the last few years, an ornery press hounded him for his entire presidency. But again, that's not unprecedented. William Randolph Hearst, as you mentioned in your book, was quite the enemy of Woodrow Wilson and considered radical and controversial. What are some of the instances of media conflict that you saw back in the early part of the 20th century that sort of resemble the media today? In other words, I don't think fake news just started a couple of years ago.
Well, when I was a lad, the press at least used to pretend that they were unbiased, neutral, just conveyors of information. And what we have now is, you know, if you're on CNN, you know, or MSNBC, you know, you're out there from the left, hard charging, and you're not paying, you know, you're not giving even any lip service to nuance. And the same might be said out on the right. But if you're if you're outright advocacy, that's not so bad. But when you're not, if you're like, say, Chris Cuomo, all right, and you pretend to be an actual journalist, and where you're interviewing your brother, which is laughable, that's pretty bad. But back in olden days of the 1900s, you would have papers which were outright either Democrat or Republican. And so William Randolph Hearst, while he becomes conservative in the 1930s and from then on, in the teens or the aughts even, he's Mr. Radical. He's a dangerous, radical left-wing guy. And he sort of starts to shift because he's not gung-ho for war in 1917. Oh, Theodore Roosevelt hates him because of that. But he shifts over, but Warren Harding, who we mentioned earlier, was a newspaper editor. I think he was head of the Republican Newspaper Editors of Ohio, if one can imagine such a organization today. And who does he run against? He runs against James Middleton Cox, who ran the Democratic paper in Dayton, Ohio. And so you would see this, over and over again. Today, we still have the Gannett chain, okay, USA Today. Back in the 1930s, Frank Gannett was going to be the vice presidential running mate if William Borah got the nomination in 1936. So this goes on for a very long time. Or famous senators like Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan. You just see one guy in politics after another. It really is open back then, and now it's open in some cases, but in other cases it's like, oh, we're just fact checking. No, you're not.
Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, and even Herbert Hoover, in some sense, they've gotten a pretty bad rap in a lot of history books. Do you believe that Donald Trump will suffer the same fate?
Well, I like to take things out. Well, it depends who writes the history. Okay. And, it's like they say, it's like, as they say and have said before, it's who counts the ballots. Okay. It's who counts the ballots, who writes the history, and will it be a more balanced account of what Trump did as opposed to often what he said, or will it be this complete attack on him, or even in the opposite degree? One of the things about writing history, I was once asked in an interview, how do you rate your book on the 1960 election versus Theodore White's The Making of the President, 1960, real classic, and which starts off the whole run of election year histories? And I say without hesitation, mine's better. Mine's better. Okay. Now, aside from sheer ego, it's because Theodore White he was writing extended journalism. So it takes a long time for the papers the private papers to come out, the private emails to come out now, the memoirs of people who have some distance and some liberty to say, what they really thought, or what they want to convey happened. And just for us to have some perspective to what follows. If Joe Biden somehow ushers in this golden age of America, well, then Trump is going to look very bad. But if the country collapses afterward, in the next 4 years, then it's going to be miss me yet. So it's a lot about context. But right now, the historical profession is largely liberal, and I think the results can be pretty well guessed for the foreseeable future.
That's it for this edition of LNTV. Remember to hit Liberty Nation News for original articles, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and our signature television program, The Conservative Five, which we like to say is more explosive than C4. Just go to libertynation.com on your browser, or hit Rumble, YouTube, and check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Leesa K. Donner, Editor-in-Chief. Thanks so much for watching. This program is a production of libertynation.com, conservative news where truth matters.